I had been swiping aimlessly for weeks, bored out of my mind and hoping to find someone interesting. When I matched with Emily, I was intrigued. Her profile was full of photos of her smiling in various beautiful locations, and her bio was witty and charming. We started chatting, and our conversation flowed effortlessly. She was funny, intelligent, and we shared so many interests. It didn't take long for me to ask her out on a date. We decided to meet at a cozy little cafe downtown, the kind of place that's perfect for a first date, casual and intimate. I arrived early, nervous but excited, and found a table in the corner where I could see the door. Emily messaged me that she was on her way, and I couldn't help but smile as I waited. When she walked in, I was stunned. She was even more beautiful in person, long brown hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that made my heart skip a beat. She spotted me immediately and made her way over. We exchanged pleasantries, and soon we were talking and laughing like old friends. But as the conversation went on, something strange started to happen. Emily would pause mid-sentence, her eyes glazing over as if she were listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she would shake her head slightly and continue as if nothing had happened. The first time, I ignored it, thinking maybe she was just nervous. But it happened again and again, each time more pronounced. At one point, she reached across the table, her hand brushing against mine. Her touch was ice cold, sending a shiver down my spine. I pulled my hand back, trying to hide my discomfort, but she didn't seem to notice. "You're really interesting," she said, her voice low and almost hypnotic. "I feel like I've known you forever." I smiled awkwardly, unsure of how to respond. There was something about her tone that made me uneasy, like there was a hidden meaning behind her words. Then she asked me the strangest question. "Have you ever met someone who looked just like you? A double?" I frowned. "No, not really." "Why?" She leaned in closer, her eyes boring into mine. "They say that if you meet your doppelganger, it's a bad omen. It means something terrible is going to happen." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the chill that had settled over me. "That's just an old myth." She didn't laugh. Instead, she stared at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "What if I told you I've seen yours?" My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Emily leaned back in her chair, her smile gone. "I saw someone who looked exactly like you, right before I came here. They were standing outside the cafe, watching me." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I turned to look out the window, but there was no one there. The street was empty, save for a few cars parked along the curb. When I turned back to her, she was gone. The chair across from me was empty, the air around it cold and still. I looked around, but there was no sign of her anywhere. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Had she really seen someone who looked like me? Was this some kind of twisted joke? I decided to leave, my nerves frayed. As I stepped out of the cafe, I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and then I saw him. Standing across the street, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, and his face was mine. He was my exact double, right down to the smallest detail. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and then he smiled, a twisted, malevolent smile that sent a bolt of terror through me. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I looked again, he was gone, vanished just as suddenly as Emily had. I ran to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove home in a daze, constantly checking my mirrors, expecting to see him following me. But the road behind me was empty. When I got home, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to calm down, to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, some kind of bizarre prank. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that twisted smile, those eyes that were my own, but filled with something dark and malevolent. I kept hearing Emily's words echoing in my mind, if you meet your doppelganger, it means something terrible is going to happen. The next morning, I received a message on Tinder from Emily. It was a single sentence, I warned you. I deleted the app, blocked her number, and tried to move on with my life. But the fear never left me. I kept seeing him, my doppelganger, out of the corner of my eye, in reflections, in crowds. Always watching, always smiling. I don't know what he wants, but I can feel him getting closer, closing in on me. And I know that when he finally catches up, something terrible is going to happen. Something that I can't escape. I wasn't expecting much from the Tinder date with Sarah. Her profile was cute, with a few pictures of her at various parks and coffee shops, but nothing that really stood out. Still, she seemed nice enough, and after a few days of chatting, we agreed to meet up for a drink at a local bar. I arrived early, as I usually do, and found a table near the back where it was quieter. The bar was dimly lit, with the low hum of conversation filling the room. I ordered a beer and waited, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Sarah showed up right on time. She was prettier in person, with soft brown hair and warm, hazel eyes. She smiled when she saw me and waved as she made her way over. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, and soon we were deep in conversation. She was easy to talk to, and I found myself relaxing, enjoying her company. But as the night went on, I started to notice something odd. Every time I looked away from her, even just for a second, she seemed to change. It was subtle at first, a shift in her posture, the way her eyes caught the light, the tone of her voice. But the more it happened, the more I realized that something was off. At one point, I glanced down at my drink, and when I looked back up, she was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her eyes seemed darker, her expression almost predatory. But then she blinked, and the look was gone, replaced by her usual friendly smile. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just imagining things, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. There was something about her that felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the more we talked, the more I wanted to leave. Then came the moment that changed everything. I excused myself to go to the restroom, leaving her at the table. When I returned a few minutes later, she was gone. I looked around the bar, but there was no sign of her. Her chair was empty, and her drink sat untouched on the table. I checked my phone to see if she had messaged me, but there was nothing. Confused, I asked the bartender if he had seen her leave, but he just shrugged, saying he hadn't noticed anything. Feeling a bit foolish, I decided to wait for a few more minutes, thinking maybe she had stepped outside for a phone call or something. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to feel more and more uneasy. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I was about to leave when I saw her. She was sitting at a table across the bar, talking to another guy. My heart skipped a beat. How had I missed her? She was wearing the same clothes, the same hairstyle, but there was something different about her. She seemed colder, more distant. Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and the way she looked at the guy across from her sent a chill down my spine. I stood there, frozen, watching as she leaned in closer to him, her expression almost hungry. The guy didn't seem to notice anything strange, laughing and talking as if nothing was wrong. But I knew. I knew something was terribly wrong. I started to walk over, intending to confront her, but then she looked up and our eyes met. For a brief moment, I saw something in her eyes, something dark and malevolent, something that wasn't human. My blood ran cold, and I stopped in my tracks. She smiled at me, a slow, chilling smile that made my skin crawl. Then she turned back to the guy, completely ignoring me as if I didn't exist. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my coat and hurried out of the bar, not daring to look back. As I walked down the dark, empty streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see her following me, but the streets were deserted. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my mind racing. Who, or what, had I been talking to all night? And what had happened to the real Sarah? I checked my phone again, hoping for some kind of explanation, but there was nothing. Her profile was still there, our conversation still in the chat, but it felt like it belonged to someone else. I deleted the app, trying to forget the whole experience, but the memory of her eyes, that cold, predatory gaze, haunted me. I started having nightmares, dreams where she would appear in the dark corners of my apartment, watching me with that same chilling smile. A few days later, I received a message from a friend who had also been using Tinder. He sent me a screenshot of a profile, Sarah's profile, but the bio was different. It was filled with strange, cryptic phrases, like, "I see you," and, "You can't hide from me." I blocked the number and tried to move on, but the fear never left me. Every time I go out, I keep expecting to see her, sitting at a bar, talking to some unsuspecting guy. I can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, hunting, waiting for her next victim. And I know, deep down, that if I ever see her again, it will be the last thing I ever do. I had been single for a while, so when I matched with a girl named Lily on Tinder, I was excited. She was stunning, long black hair, piercing green eyes, and a smile that seemed to light up the room, even in her photos. Our conversation flowed easily, and we quickly made plans to meet up. She suggested we meet at her place for dinner, and I, eager to impress, agreed without hesitation. Her house was on the outskirts of town, a bit isolated but charming in a rustic way. When I arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the gravel driveway. I parked my car and walked up to the front door, feeling a mix of anticipation and nerves. Lily greeted me with a warm smile, looking even more beautiful in person. She invited me in, and I couldn't help but admire the interior of her home. It was tastefully decorated, with antique furniture and soft, ambient lighting. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As we sat down to dinner, I noticed that the house was filled with mirrors. They were everywhere, on the walls, in the hallway, even on the dining room table. Each one was different, some ornate and old, others sleek and modern. It was strange, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I didn't mention it. Lily noticed me glancing at the mirrors and smiled. "I've always been fascinated by them," she said, her voice soft and melodic. "They say mirrors are gateways to other worlds, reflections of things we can't see." I nodded, not really sure how to respond. The food was delicious, and we talked and laughed throughout the meal. But as the evening went on, I started to feel a growing sense of unease. The mirrors seemed to multiply, their reflections catching my eye at odd angles, creating a dizzying maze of images. At one point, I excused myself to use the restroom. As I walked down the hallway, I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the mirrors. But something was wrong. The reflection wasn't quite right, it was delayed, like an old movie with the audio out of sync. I stared at it, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light. But then my reflection moved, even though I hadn't. It smiled, a slow, sinister smile that didn't reach my eyes. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection followed me, its smile widening, as if it knew something I didn't. I rushed back to the dining room, trying to shake off the creeping dread that had settled over me. Lily was waiting, her expression calm and unreadable. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice tinged with concern. "Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just, needed a moment." She didn't press the issue, but I could tell she knew something was wrong. We continued our conversation, but I was distracted, my mind racing with what I had seen. I couldn't stop thinking about that twisted reflection, how it had moved on its own. As the night wore on, I started to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. The mirrors seemed to crowd the space, their reflections overlapping, creating a disorienting labyrinth. I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to offend Lily. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made my excuses and said I had to leave. Lily's smile faltered for a moment, and I thought I saw something dark flicker in her eyes, but she nodded and walked me to the door. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice soft and almost sad. "I hope you had a good time." I mumbled something polite and hurried out the door, relief flooding through me as I stepped into the cool night air. But as I walked to my car, I felt that same eerie sensation of being watched. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Lily standing in the doorway, her face partially obscured by the shadows. But it wasn't just her. There, in the windows of the house, I saw countless reflections, my reflections, staring back at me, each one with that same twisted smile, their eyes following my every move. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the car door. When I finally got it open, I jumped in and slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart, and glanced back at the house. Lily was still there, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. But the reflections were gone, leaving only the dark windows staring back at me. I sped away, not daring to look back until I was miles from her house. Even then, the image of those twisted reflections haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that one of those reflections had slipped through the mirror and was now lurking just out of sight. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, those smiling, twisted versions of myself, waiting in the shadows, watching me through the mirrors. I've tried to move on, but the fear lingers. I've covered every mirror in my apartment, but it doesn't help. I can still feel them, lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. And when that moment comes, I know they'll pull me through, trapping me in their world while one of them takes my place. Forever.